Before I let my son marry her, I had to know. Did she love him, or his money? My name is Margaret, and I've spent my whole life working hard to give my only son, Daniel, everything I never had. I was a widow for 15 years. I ran a small tailoring shop, saved every penny, and eventually built a comfortable life for both of us. People in our town respected me, not for my wealth, but for my honesty and the way I treated others. Daniel grew up kind and humble, but after he got a well-paying job in the city, things started changing. He began dating a woman named Sophie, beautiful, elegant, and very polite. At least, that's what I thought. When I first met her, she smiled too perfectly, spoke too softly, and praised everything around her, except the people. Something in her eyes felt calculating, though I couldn't prove it. One evening, Daniel called me, sounding excited. "Mom, Sophie's family wants to meet you. We're planning to get engaged soon." I smiled on the phone, but my heart tightened. I didn't want to lose him to someone who might only love his money. That night, I couldn't sleep. So I made a plan. A dangerous one, but one that would show me the truth. When the meeting day came, I put away all my jewelry, wore my oldest dress, and tied my hair with a faded scarf. I told Daniel I'd meet them at the restaurant, alone. I wanted Sophie and her family to see me not as Daniel's mother, the retired shop owner, but as an ordinary poor woman. As I walked into that restaurant, people stared. Some smiled politely, others ignored me completely. And there, at the corner table, sat Sophie and her parents. In fancy clothes, their faces painted with confidence. Sophie waved half-heartedly, like she was greeting a stranger she didn't really want to know. I smiled, sat down, and said softly, "I hope I'm not too late." The bus was running slow. Her mother frowned. Her father glanced at my worn shoes. And that was the moment I knew, this test was going to reveal everything. 5 minutes into dinner, I heard words that shattered my heart, and confirmed my suspicions. It only took 5 minutes for her true colors to show. The waiter came with menus, bowing politely to Sophie's parents. But when he turned to me, he hesitated, probably because of my worn dress and patched handbag. I smiled to ease the awkwardness, but no one else did. Sophie crossed her legs elegantly and said in a sweet tone, "Oh, don't worry, Mom. You don't have to order much. The portions here are quite big." "Mom." She said it like a joke. Her parents chuckled softly, and I felt my cheeks warm. "That's kind of you, dear," I said with a smile, "but I can manage." Her mother leaned toward her and whispered, not as quietly as she thought, "Daniel's mother? Really? She doesn't look like it." I kept my eyes on the menu, pretending not to hear, but my heart felt heavy. Then, when the waiter returned to take our order, Sophie said, "We'll have the steak for us three. And maybe the vegetable soup for her." For her. No name. No respect. Just her. I smiled politely and said, "Soup is fine." Inside, I was crumbling. Throughout dinner, they spoke only about expensive things. Vacations, cars, designer brands. Sophie bragged about how Daniel bought her a gold bracelet last week. She didn't once ask about me, my life, or Daniel's childhood. But the moment she thought I wasn't listening, she leaned toward her mother and said, "I hope Daniel doesn't expect us to live near her. I couldn't survive in that tiny house." Her mother laughed. Her father nodded approvingly. I didn't say a word. I just smiled gently and continued eating my soup. But in that silence, I made a decision. One that would change all of our lives. If Sophie loved Daniel truly, she would learn humility. And if she didn't, she would learn loss. The next morning, I called Daniel and said, "Son, I'd like Sophie to come stay with me for a week before the engagement. Just the two of us, to bond." He hesitated. "Mom, are you sure? She's not used to." I interrupted softly. "That's exactly why." When Sophie arrived at my house a few days later, her reaction at the door told me everything I needed to know. You can tell a person's heart by how they treat you when they think you have nothing. 3 days later, a silver car stopped in front of my small house. The neighbors peeked through their windows. Visitors were rare for me. Sophie stepped out, wearing heels that didn't belong on my dusty street. She looked around like she had just stepped into another world, one she didn't want to be in. I opened the door and smiled warmly. "Welcome, my dear. I'm so happy you came." She forced a smile. "Of course, Mrs. Margaret," Daniel insisted. I noticed her eyes scanning the small front yard, the old wooden gate, the faded paint on my walls. She didn't say a word, but her face said everything. Inside, I had prepared her room, simple, neat, with handmade curtains and a vase of fresh flowers. I had even ironed her bed sheets twice, hoping she'd feel comfortable. But as she stepped in, she wrinkled her nose slightly. "It's cozy," she said carefully, placing her designer bag on the chair like she was afraid to touch anything. I smiled again. "I made you some tea. I thought we could talk a bit before dinner." She nodded but didn't sit down until I offered her the cleanest chair. Over tea, I tried to ask about her life, her work, her hobbies. She answered politely but without warmth. Then she glanced at my hands and frowned. "Do you still work?" I smiled. "Sometimes. I do a bit of sewing for neighbors." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Oh, that's nice. Daniel never told me that." I chuckled softly. He probably didn't think it was important. After tea, she got up and said she was tired. I offered to show her where to freshen up. When she saw the small bathroom, simple, with a bucket and a mirror that had lost its shine, she turned to me and said quietly, "I think I'll wait until tomorrow." That night, I heard her tossing and turning in her room. She wasn't used to the sounds of crickets, the old fan humming, or the creak of wooden floors. I lay awake too, staring at the ceiling, thinking, if she cannot handle one night here, how will she handle a lifetime with my son? The next morning, she came out wearing sunglasses to hide her tired eyes. "Mrs. Margaret," she said with a forced smile, "I'll go to the city for the day. I have a few errands." I nodded politely. "Of course, dear. Take your time." But as she left, I whispered to myself, "This test isn't over yet." The next day, I gave her one simple task, and her reaction showed me everything I needed to know. Sometimes, it takes the smallest task to reveal the biggest truth. On the second morning, I decided to test Sophie, not through wealth or words, but through kindness. I woke early as I always do, to prepare breakfast. Simple bread, eggs, and tea. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, and the smell of toasted bread filled the air. When Sophie came out of her room, she looked exhausted. She glanced at the breakfast table and smiled faintly. "Oh, you cooked?" I nodded. "Yes, dear. I made some extra if you'd like to help me serve." She hesitated, a long pause that told me more than words. Then she sat down at the table and reached for her phone. "I'm not really good at serving," she said casually. "At home, we have someone who does that." I smiled gently. "Well, today it's just us. I'd love your company." She didn't move. I quietly served her plate, pretending not to notice her discomfort. Halfway through breakfast, I said softly, "I need to run a small errand. Could you please help sweep the front yard while I'm gone? It's only for a few minutes." Her face froze. "Me? Sweep?" I nodded kindly. "Just a quick cleanup, dear. The broom is near the door." She forced a laugh. "Mrs. Margaret, I've never even held a broom before." Her tone wasn't rude, but it wasn't respectful either. It was laced with disbelief, like I had asked her to do something impossible. I smiled again, refusing to react. "It's okay, dear. You can learn. Everyone starts somewhere." When I returned an hour later, the broom was still untouched. Sophie was sitting outside, scrolling on her phone, legs crossed neatly, looking impatient. "I didn't want to ruin my nails," she said lightly. I nodded, keeping my calm. "That's all right. It's not your fault." Maybe Daniel should learn what kind of woman you truly are before he promises you forever. Her head snapped up. What do you mean? I looked her in the eyes and said quietly, love is not about comfort, Sophie. It's about character. And from what I've seen, your heart only loves luxury, not people. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She stood silently, clearly offended. Later that day, she called Daniel, and I heard her crying through the door. Your mother doesn't like me, she said. She's testing me, humiliating me. I smiled sadly to myself. She wasn't wrong. But the test wasn't over. Because that night, life itself decided to give Sophie a lesson I never could. When a sudden storm hit that evening, Sophie was forced to face a truth she had never imagined. Sometimes, life teaches the lesson we're too kind to give. That evening, dark clouds gathered across the sky. The wind howled through the narrow streets, shaking windows and doors. I looked up from my sewing machine and whispered, "A storm's coming." Sophie was sitting on the couch, frustrated. She had been trying to get a taxi all day to return to the city, but no one was willing to drive in the approaching rain. "This place is impossible," she muttered under her breath. "Even the weather feels poor." I said nothing. I simply handed her a blanket and said softly, "It might get cold tonight. You can rest in my room. The window there doesn't leak." She sighed. "Thanks, Mrs. Margaret. But I'll be fine here." Moments later, the rain came, heavy, roaring, relentless. Thunder cracked through the sky, shaking the little house. Then, the lights went out. Sophie gasped. "What happened?" I lit a candle and smiled gently. "Don't worry, dear. It's just a power cut. It happens often here." She looked around nervously as water began dripping from the corner of the ceiling. I rushed to put a pot underneath, while she clutched her phone, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. "This is awful," she whispered. "How can you live like this?" I looked at her and said softly, "Because life isn't about what you have, Sophie. It's about who you are when everything else is gone." She didn't respond. Her eyes followed me as I carefully covered the window with a piece of cloth to block the wind. I was soaked, but I smiled. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door. It was old Mrs. Turner, my elderly neighbor, shivering in the rain. Her roof had started leaking badly. Without a second thought, I grabbed an umbrella and helped her inside. I offered her tea and gave her my own blanket. Sophie watched silently. When Mrs. Turner thanked me, saying, "You're an angel, Margaret," Sophie lowered her eyes. For the first time, she looked ashamed. That night, we sat in candlelight, the three of us, sipping hot tea while thunder rumbled outside. I noticed Sophie staring quietly at her phone. She wasn't scrolling anymore. She was thinking. When Mrs. Turner left, Sophie helped me pick up the cups. She didn't say much, but before going to bed, she whispered, "You didn't have to help that woman. She's not your responsibility." I smiled softly. "That's what love is, dear. Helping even when you don't have to." She looked at me for a long time. And for the first time since she arrived, she didn't look away. That night, the storm didn't just flood the streets. It washed away her pride. The next morning, Sophie did something I never expected, and it brought tears to my eyes. Some hearts don't change with words. They change when they finally see love. The storm passed by morning. The sun peeked through the clouds, and the world outside smelled like wet earth and forgiveness. When I stepped into the living room, I froze. Sophie was standing by the sink, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, washing the dishes. I blinked, thinking I was still dreaming. She turned and gave me a shy smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Margaret." I thought I'd help a little. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just watched her. Her delicate hands, the same ones that once refused to hold a broom, were now scrubbing plates gently. "That's very kind of you," I said softly. "You don't have to." She shook her head. "No, I want to." Last night. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how you helped that old lady. You didn't even hesitate. Her voice trembled slightly. I've spent so long caring about appearances, clothes, status, luxury, that I forgot what kindness even looks like. I walked closer and placed a hand on her shoulder. We all forget sometimes, dear. Life has a way of reminding us. She smiled faintly and said, I was so wrong about you. About everything. Later that day, she insisted on helping me with chores. She even went to Mrs. Turner's house to check if her roof was okay. When she returned, she had a small tear in her blouse and a smudge of dust on her cheek. But she looked happier than I'd ever seen her. She told me stories about you, Sophie said, laughing. You've been helping everyone in this neighborhood for years. I shrugged. It's just what neighbors do. Sophie looked at me, eyes glistening. You're a good woman, Mrs. Margaret. I'm sorry I didn't see that before. That evening, Daniel came to pick her up. When he entered, he looked nervous, probably expecting complaints or disapproval. But before I could speak, Sophie took his hand and said softly, Daniel, your mother is the most extraordinary woman I've ever met. You're lucky to be her son. My throat tightened. Tears welled up, but I held them back. As they left, she turned at the door and said, I'll come back soon. Not as your guest, but as your daughter. A month later, at their engagement ceremony, Sophie did something that silenced the entire room. A month later, she proved that lessons born in humility never fade. The day of the engagement arrived. The hall was filled with music, flowers, and laughter. Guests admired the decor, the sparkling lights, and Sophie's elegant dress. She truly looked radiant. Daniel looked proud and happy. And me. I sat quietly at the corner table, smiling, content just to see him smile. When the host invited Sophie to say a few words, she took the microphone with trembling hands. Her voice was soft but steady. Before I say anything, she began, there's someone I need to thank, someone who taught me what love and respect truly mean. The crowd fell silent. Daniel looked confused. Sophie turned toward me, tears in her eyes. A few weeks ago, I met a woman I thought was poor. I judged her for how she dressed, for where she lived, for the simplicity of her life. But that woman, her voice cracked, gave me more love and wisdom than anyone ever has. Whispers filled the room. All eyes turned to me. Sophie smiled through her tears. That woman is now my mother. And I want everyone here to know that she is the richest person I've ever met. Not because of money, but because of her heart. She walked down from the stage, straight toward me. Everyone watched as she knelt in front of me, in her expensive gown, and took my hands in hers. Mrs. Margaret, she said softly, thank you for teaching me humility, kindness, and love. I promise I will never forget what you showed me. Tears rolled down my cheeks. I lifted her up and whispered, you've already passed the only test that mattered. The room erupted in applause. Even those who had once looked down on me stood and clapped. Later, when Daniel hugged me and said, Mom, you always know how to see the truth. I smiled and replied, no, son. I just listen, not to what people say, but to what their hearts show. That day, I learned something too. We often think we're testing others, but sometimes, it's life that's testing us. Money fades, beauty fades, but a kind heart, that never goes out of style. So never judge someone by what they wear, where they live, or what they own. Because sometimes, the poorest hands hold the richest hearts. Red Heart.